Long before the roar of engines filled American roads, before highways stretched across the country, and before automobiles became a symbol of freedom, there was a different kind of movement, a slower one, a quieter one, a world where transportation depended not on machines, but on horses. And in that world, one name began to rise. The name was Studebaker Corporation. In the mid-19th century, America was still developing. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, and the need for reliable transportation was increasing every day. At that time, wagons were not just a convenience. They were essential. They carried goods across long distances. They supported businesses. They connected communities. And building a strong, durable wagon required skill, precision, and an understanding of craftsmanship. This is where the Studebaker story begins. Founded in 1852, the company did not start as a massive industrial operation. It began as a small workshop, a place where wood, metal, and human effort came together to create something practical, something reliable, something built to last. The early years were defined by hard work, attention to detail, and a commitment to quality that would later define the company's identity. As demand for wagons increased, so did the company's reputation. Customers began to recognize the difference. Studebaker wagons were not just functional, they were dependable, strong enough to handle long journeys, reliable enough to support daily use, and over time, that reliability became their greatest strength. One of the turning points came during the American Civil War. The demand for transportation equipment increased dramatically. Armies needed wagons to move supplies, food, equipment, everything required to support military operations. Studebaker stepped into this moment, supplying wagons that met the demands of the time, and in doing so, the company expanded rapidly, production increased, operations grew, and the small workshop began to transform into something much larger. By the late 1800s, Studebaker had become one of the most recognized wagon manufacturers in the United States. Its products were used across the country, from farms to cities, from businesses to military operations. The company had built a strong foundation, one based on trust, quality, and consistency. But as the new century approached, change was already on the horizon. The world was beginning to shift. New technologies were emerging, and one invention in particular was about to redefine everything: the automobile. At first, cars were seen as experimental, unreliable, expensive, and far from practical for everyday use. For a company like Studebaker, which had built its success on wagons, the idea of shifting to automobiles was not an obvious choice, because wagons still worked, they were still in demand, and the business was stable. But history has shown that stability does not guarantee permanence, because when new technology appears, it does not ask for permission. It changes the rules, and the companies that survive are the ones that recognize that change early. Inside Studebaker, this realization began to take shape. Slowly, carefully. The company did not abandon its wagon business immediately. Instead, it observed. It studied the emerging automobile industry. It evaluated the risks, and it considered the possibilities. Because moving into automobiles was not just about building a new product, it was about transforming an entire business model. New machines, new skills, new systems, everything would need to evolve. And yet, the potential was undeniable. Cars represented the future, a future where speed replaced endurance, where engines replaced horses, where transportation became faster, more efficient, and more accessible. For a company that had mastered the art of building wagons, this presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity to lead in a new industry, and the challenge of leaving behind the system that had brought them success. As the early 1900s approached, the decision became unavoidable. Studebaker began its transition, entering the automobile market. At first, cautiously, experimenting with designs, exploring both electric and gasoline-powered vehicles, trying to understand what would define the next era of transportation. Inside the factories, this shift was significant. Workers who had spent years building wagons now had to adapt to new methods, new materials, new technologies. The environment began to change, not suddenly, but steadily, and with that change came uncertainty, because no one could predict exactly how the automobile industry would evolve, or which companies would succeed, or which would fade away. But one thing was clear: the world was moving forward, and standing still was no longer an option. For Studebaker, this was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter filled with potential, with ambition, and with risks that had never been faced before. The company that once it had found its position, a manufacturer that combined tradition with innovation, a brand that carried the past into the future. But beneath this growth, the foundation of a new challenge was already forming, because the same industry that was creating opportunity was also creating pressure. Mass production was changing expectations. Customers began to value affordability as much as quality, and the gap between companies that could produce at scale and those that focused on craftsmanship continued to grow. For now, Studebaker remains strong, its reputation intact, its operations expanding, its future filled with potential. But as history has shown time and time again, the period of growth is often followed by a period of testing, and the decisions made during that time determine what comes next. For Studebaker, the journey into the automobile age had begun successfully, but the road ahead would demand more than just adaptation. Chapter 2: The Rise of a New Machine Age. By the time the early 20th century began to take shape, the name Studebaker Corporation was no longer just associated with wagons. It had become something more, a company standing at the edge of transformation, a business that had mastered one era and was now stepping into another. The transition from wagons to automobiles was not immediate. It did not happen overnight, because the world itself was still adjusting. Horse-drawn transportation had not disappeared. In fact, it remained deeply integrated into daily life. Cities still relied on it, businesses still depended on it, and for many people, the idea of replacing horses with machines seemed uncertain, risky, even unnecessary. But progress rarely waits for comfort, and slowly the presence of automobiles began to grow. At first they were rare, seen as experimental machines used by innovators and early adopters. But with each passing year, improvements were made, engines became more reliable, designs became more practical, and the idea of owning a car began to shift from curiosity to possibility. Inside Studebaker, this shift was being closely observed. The company had already built a reputation for quality, for reliability, for craftsmanship, and now the question was no longer whether automobiles would succeed, but whether Studebaker could succeed within that new industry. The decision to move forward was not simple. It required investment, new machinery, new knowledge, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to change. Because building wagons and building automobiles were not the same. One relied on traditional craftsmanship, the other demanded engineering, precision, and an understanding of mechanical systems that were still evolving. And yet, Studebaker moved forward, carefully, strategically. In the early stages, the company explored multiple directions. Electric vehicles were considered, gasoline-powered engines were tested, different designs were evaluated, because at that time, the future of the automobile was not yet decided. No one knew which technology would dominate or which approach would define the industry. Inside the factories, the environment began to change. Workers who had spent years shaping wood and assembling wagons were introduced to new tools, new processes, new expectations. The transition required training, adaptation, and patience, because learning something entirely new takes time, and mistakes were part of that process. But with each attempt, the company moved closer to understanding what the future required. Gradually, gasoline-powered vehicles began to show greater potential. They offered range, power, and flexibility that electric models of the time could not match. And as this became clear, Studebaker began to focus more heavily on gasoline automobiles. This marked a turning point, not just for the company, but for its identity. Because now it was no longer a wagon manufacturer exploring new ideas. It was becoming an automobile company, a participant in an industry that was growing faster than anyone had expected. As production increased, the scale of operations expanded. Factories were modified, new equipment was installed, processes were refined to improve efficiency. The company began to develop its own approach to automobile manufacturing, one that balanced its tradition of quality with the demands of a new industry. Customers began to take notice. Studebaker vehicles carried a reputation that came from decades of craftsmanship, and that reputation translated into trust. People believed in the name. They associated it with durability, with reliability, with products that were built to last, and in a time when automobiles were still proving themselves, that trust mattered. Sales began to grow, slowly at first, then more steadily. The company established a presence in the market, not as the largest manufacturer, but as a respected one, a brand that stood for quality in a rapidly expanding industry. At the same time, competition was increasing. Companies like Ford Motor Company were introducing new methods, mass production, assembly lines, systems designed to produce vehicles at a scale that had never been seen before. Cars became faster to build, cheaper to produce, more accessible to the average consumer. For Studebaker, this presented both an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity to grow within a booming industry, and the challenge of competing with companies that prioritize speed and volume over craftsmanship. Inside the company, the approach remained balanced. Studebaker did not abandon its focus on quality, but it also recognized the need to improve efficiency. Production methods were adjusted, processes were streamlined, and efforts were made to remain competitive in a market that was evolving rapidly. This period became one of growth, expansion, and increasing confidence. The company was no longer uncertain about its place in the automobile industry. Chapter 3: The Golden Years of an American Icon. By the 1920s, the name Studebaker Corporation had firmly established itself within the American automobile industry. What began as a cautious transition from wagons to cars had now transformed into something far more powerful: confidence, momentum, and a growing reputation that extended far beyond its origins. This was the period when Studebaker was no longer adapting to change. It was thriving within it. The automobile industry itself was expanding rapidly. Road networks were improving, cities were becoming more connected, and cars were no longer considered experimental machines. They had become a part of everyday life, a symbol of mobility, of independence, of progress. For many Americans, owning a car was no longer a distant idea. It was an achievable goal. And within this growing market, Studebaker found its place, not as the cheapest option, not as the fastest producer, but as a company known for something different: quality, design, and a sense of refinement that set it apart from many competitors. Inside the factories, production had reached a new level of efficiency. The lessons learned during the early transition years were now fully integrated into the system. Processes were smoother, coordination between departments had improved, and the entire operation functioned with a sense of purpose that had taken years to develop. Workers were no longer adapting to change. They had mastered it. Each part of the process, from design to assembly, reflected a balance between traditional craftsmanship and modern manufacturing. This balance became one of Studebaker's defining strengths. While companies like Ford Motor Company focused heavily on mass production, producing vehicles at an unprecedented scale, Studebaker maintained its commitment to detail. Its vehicles were not just built quickly, they were built carefully, and customers noticed. Studebaker cars began to develop a reputation for reliability and style. They were seen as dependable, durable, and refined, a choice for those who wanted something more than just basic transportation. This reputation allowed the company to expand its reach. Dealerships grew, sales increased, and the brand became recognized across the United States. There was a sense that Studebaker had found the perfect balance. Modern enough to compete, traditional enough to stand out, the company also introduced new designs that captured attention. Cars were no longer just functional machines. They were becoming expressions of style, of identity, and Studebaker embraced this idea. Its vehicles featured distinctive shapes, elegant lines, and a level of aesthetic appeal that reflected the changing expectations of consumers. This was not just about transportation anymore, it was about experience. And in this area, Studebaker excelled. The 1930s brought challenges in the form of economic uncertainty. The Great Depression affected industries across the country. Demand slowed, markets became unstable, and many companies struggled to survive. Yet, even during this difficult period, Studebaker demonstrated resilience. Adjustments were made, costs were managed, and the company continued to operate while others disappeared. This ability to endure added to its reputation. It was no longer just a successful company, it was a stable one, a brand that could withstand pressure and continue moving forward. As the years progressed, the company entered what could truly be considered its golden era. The 1940s and early 1950s brought renewed growth. Technological advancements improved vehicle performance, design innovations made cars more appealing, and the post-war economy created new opportunities for expansion. Studebaker capitalized on this moment, production increased, new models were introduced, and the brand continued to strengthen its position within the market. There was a sense of optimism, a belief that the future held even greater possibilities. Inside the factories, activity was constant, machines operated at full capacity, workers moved with confidence and efficiency. The system functioned as it was meant to, every part connected, every process aligned. From the outside, everything appeared stable, strong, unshakable. The company had come a long way from its beginnings as a wagon manufacturer. It had adapted to change, it had embraced a new industry, and it had built a reputation that placed it among the respected names of American automotive history. But within this success, there were subtle signs of a changing landscape. The industry itself was evolving, competition was becoming more intense, companies were investing heavily in new production methods, efficiency was becoming more important than ever, and the scale at which vehicles could be produced began to redefine what success looked like. For now, these changes did not seem like immediate threats. Studebaker was still strong, still respected, still growing, but the foundation of the Chapter 4. The pressure begins to build. At the height of its success, the name Studebaker Corporation seemed unshakable. Its vehicles were respected, its factories were active, its reputation had been built over decades of consistency and quality. From the outside, everything appeared stable, but within the rapidly evolving automobile industry, change was accelerating. And with that change came pressure. Not the kind that appears suddenly, but the kind that builds slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed at first. The industry that had once been filled with experimentation and opportunity was now becoming structured, competitive, and increasingly driven by efficiency. Companies were no longer just trying to build good cars. They were trying to build more cars, faster, cheaper, and at a scale that could dominate the market. This shift was led by companies like Ford Motor Company, which had transformed production through the use of assembly lines. The idea was simple: break down the manufacturing process into smaller, repeatable steps, reduce time, increase output, and lower costs. The result was revolutionary. Cars that were once considered expensive became more affordable, more accessible, and available to a much larger population. For many consumers, price began to matter as much as quality, and in some cases, even more. For Studebaker, this created a challenge. Because its identity had never been based on producing the cheapest vehicles, it had been built on craftsmanship, on reliability, on attention to detail, and while these qualities still held value, they were no longer the only factors driving consumer decisions. Inside the company, this shift could not be ignored. Sales patterns began to change, competition intensified, and the gap between companies that could produce at scale and those that focused on refinement continued to widen. At first, the impact was manageable. Studebaker still had a strong reputation, customers still trusted the brand, and production continued at a steady pace. But beneath that stability, the pressure was growing. The company faced a difficult question. Should it maintain its traditional approach or adapt to a new system that prioritized efficiency over craftsmanship? The answer was not simple, because changing production methods was not just a technical decision, it was a cultural one. It required rethinking how the company operated, how its workers were trained, how its factories were structured, and how its products were designed. Gradually, efforts were made to improve efficiency, processes were adjusted, costs were analyzed, and attempts were made to remain competitive in a market that was evolving rapidly. But these changes were not always seamless. Because transitioning from a system built on craftsmanship to one driven by speed requires more than just adjustments. It requires transformation, and transformation takes time that the industry was not willing to give. As the 1950s approached, the pressure became more visible. Large manufacturers like General Motors had established systems that allowed them to produce vehicles in massive quantities. They could offer variety, affordability, and widespread availability. Their presence dominated the market. For consumers, the choices were expanding. Cars were no longer rare purchases. They were becoming standard. And with that shift, expectations changed. People wanted value, reliability, and accessibility. Studebaker, while still respected, found itself caught between two identities. Not as affordable as mass-produced vehicles, not as exclusive as high-end luxury brands. This position made competition increasingly difficult. Inside the factories, the effects began to show. Production targets became harder to maintain, costs remained high, and the balance between quality and affordability became more challenging. Workers continued their routines, machines continued to operate, but the sense of certainty that once defined the system began to weaken. Decisions became more complex. Each choice carried risk. Reducing costs could affect quality, maintaining quality could affect pricing, and in a competitive market, even small differences could have significant consequences. Despite these challenges, the company continued to push forward. New models were introduced, strategies were adjusted, efforts were made to stay relevant in an industry that was moving faster than ever before. From the outside, the company still appeared strong. Its name still carried recognition, its products still held value. But inside, the pressure was building, because the problem was not just competition, it was structural. The entire industry had shifted toward a model that favored scale, and companies that could not fully adapt to that model faced increasing difficulty. For Studebaker, the foundation that had once been its greatest strength was now becoming a limitation. Craftsmanship, attention to detail, and commitment to quality. Chapter 5. The Slow Decline. By the mid-1950s, the position of Studebaker Corporation had begun to shift in a way that was no longer easy to ignore. What once felt like pressure now started to feel like decline. Not sudden, not dramatic, but steady, persistent, and increasingly visible. The automobile industry had reached a level of maturity where competition was no longer just intense. It was overwhelming. Large manufacturers like General Motors and Ford Motor Company had perfected systems that allowed them to dominate the market. Their ability to produce vehicles at scale gave them a significant advantage. They could reduce costs, offer competitive pricing, and release new models more frequently. For consumers, this meant more choices, more affordability, and a faster cycle of innovation. For Studebaker, it meant something else entirely, a growing struggle to keep up. The company's identity had always been rooted in craftsmanship, in building vehicles that reflected quality and attention to detail, but the market was no longer driven by those values alone. Price had become a deciding factor, and in many cases, the deciding factor. Inside the company, the impact was becoming clear. Sales numbers began to fluctuate, then decline, not drastically at first, but enough to create concern. Production schedules were adjusted, costs were reviewed, and efforts were made to stabilize operations. But each adjustment revealed a deeper challenge. The cost of production remained high. The systems in place were not designed for the kind of scale that competitors had achieved, and every attempt to reduce costs came with consequences. Reducing expenses often meant compromising on elements that had defined the brand. Materials, finishing, attention to detail. These were not just features, they were part of the company's identity, and altering them was not a simple decision. At the same time, maintaining those standards made it difficult to compete on price. This created a situation where the company was caught between two positions, unable to fully compete with mass producers, and no longer positioned as a true luxury brand. This in-between space became increasingly difficult to sustain. Inside the factories, the change was noticeable. Production lines that once operated with confidence now faced uncertainty. Orders were less predictable, workloads varied, and the consistency that had once defined operations began to fade. Workers felt the difference, not always through official announcements, but through experience. Shifts changed, schedules adjusted, and the sense of long-term stability began to weaken. Some departments were affected more than others. Certain production lines slowed, others faced temporary pauses. At first, these pauses were short, manageable, but over time they became more frequent, longer, and more difficult to ignore. Management responded with strategies aimed at recovery. New models were introduced in an attempt to attract customers. Design changes were made to appeal to modern preferences. Marketing efforts increased, but these efforts required investment, and investment during a period of declining revenue created additional pressure. The balance between spending and saving became increasingly difficult. Every decision carried risk. Spend too much, and financial strain increased. Spend too little, and the company risked falling further behind. This constant balancing act created instability, not just in numbers, but in direction, because without a clear path forward, even strong companies can begin to lose momentum. As the years progressed, the situation became more challenging. The gap between Studebaker and its larger competitors continued to widen. Their ability to innovate quickly, to produce efficiently, and to dominate market share left little room for smaller companies to compete effectively. Inside the organization, difficult decisions had to be made. Costs needed to be reduced further, operations needed to be streamlined, and in some cases, positions needed to be eliminated. These decisions were not taken lightly because behind every role was a person, a worker, a family, a life connected to the stability of the company. And as those decisions took effect, the human impact became undeniable. The sense of pride that had once defined the workplace began to shift. It was replaced by uncertainty, by caution, by the quiet understanding that the company was no longer moving forward, but trying to hold its ground. Despite these challenges, the company did not collapse immediately. It continued to operate, to produce, to adapt where possible. From the outside, it still appeared active, functional, present. But inside, the reality was different. The system was under strain, and that strain was increasing. Because decline is rarely a single event. It is a process, a gradual movement away from stability, a series of small changes that, over time, lead to a larger outcome. For Studebaker,